Well, everyone, welcome to another Direct Connect with Archer. Mark Brahmstadt. Here with me is Steve Parker and Leonard Chamberlin, managing partners here at Archer. Hello, Steve. Hello, Leonard. How are y'all doing?
Hi, Mark. I'm doing well.
Doing well, thank you. Good morning.
I know today we want to talk about oil and gas, security directives, TSA, and all things included there. So I know we want to really spend some time today on Security Directive 2. 2C, that is specifically, but maybe for those that are newer to the industry, maybe haven't been following as close or just didn't know that Security Directive 2C was out. Maybe we could start with maybe a 60-second history as to where the security directives came from and why they came out. One of you want to take a swing there? That would be a great start, I think.
Yeah, we're going to arm wrestle for this one, Leonard. Or do you want to take it a run?
I was going to start with the dinosaurs dying and creating oil, so probably better for you to start.
Yeah, we only got 60 seconds. So in a nutshell, a couple years ago, some bad people did a bad thing to a pipeline, caused a lot of problems, and so the federal government felt they had to react to that and make the pipeline companies do good things to stop the bad people from doing bad things. Let me expand on that just a little bit. It might be a bit simplistic, but so the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, does have regulatory authority over the interstate pipeline companies. And as a result of the Colonial Pipeline attack a couple years back, they decided it was time to put in place some mandatory cybersecurity requirements for the industry. They did it under their emergency authority. So these are ostensibly temporary requirements. The intent is that they will come back with permanent standards at some point in the future. But these are emergency authority to invoke temporary, quote-unquote, temporary requirements for the industry, specifically to address some of the concerns that were raised from the Colonial Pipeline attack, and requirements specifically address some of the vectors that were used in that. So in a nutshell, that's where this came from.
I think that's helpful, especially for those that maybe not have been following it in industry or maybe new to the industry. I know when I came to Archer almost 5 years ago, I think the common sentence that I heard both from clients, prospects, even internally was, we're probably one event away from oil and gas having some sort of regulation, and that event has now happened. That really spurred that regulation. Leonard, maybe for you, what's been challenging in the industry for those to address the TSA security directives?
There have been a number of challenges, Mark. Difficult to, I think, pin a primary talking point in that regard. Two things jump out, though, as I think about it. One is the timing. Some very aggressive time frames were attached to the security directives, literally moving mountains from a cybersecurity and compliance perspective to implement some of these measures within 30 days. Other measures had longer time frames, but again, 0 to 100 and like that, and expecting change was very aggressive on TSA's part. Secondly, I would say just again, with the speed at which the measures were expected to be implemented, establishing a compliance regime where one previously did not really exist. The oil and natural gas partners that we have had the opportunity to work with clearly understand cybersecurity, clearly already had existing postures to leverage in that regard. But this compliance factor is something very new to them, and I think going to continue to be a challenge for the industry.
And most recently, the most recent security directive was released just a couple of weeks ago. Maybe we can spend a little time on what that security directive is focused on, it kind of as a go forward. So, Steve, maybe you want to give us your thoughts on that security directive. I think it's affectionately known as 2C.
It is. It's Security Directive too, and to be careful, you're going to have me saying Service Directive before too long. You get it in your mind, it kind of sticks, but it is a Security Directive. And then it's Security Directive 2. It was the second one that was issued back in 2021. Version C, there's been a couple minor amendments to it. Version C was required because these directives only have a 12-month lifespan. As I mentioned, they are temporary in nature, so they need to be renewed. So version C renewed the directive from 2021 and did some fairly significant changes to it. The core of what TSA wants to be done is pretty much the same. What they've done in this version is allowed for more flexibility. So they've softened some of the language, modified some of the language so that entities are given flexibility in how they approach it or meet the objectives, but the underlying objectives of what TSA wants accomplished from a security perspective really have not changed significantly.
What are some of the must-dos as part of the SD2C?
There's three that come to mind. The first one is that's requiring an implementation plan. So I mentioned this desire to give more flexibility to industry. So there are some specific measures that need to be addressed, but the TSA is now both permitting and requiring entities to develop an implementation plan that lays out in detail how they are going to meet those objectives along with timelines. So a pipeline operator might be able to say, well, we want to use this technology versus that. They can make those decisions, but they still have to put that plan down on paper. They have to put in the timelines for that. And then ultimately, TSA has the authority to review that plan and must approve it, acknowledging that it's going to meet the objective. So that's one big one. Another one is the requirement to establish, implement, and maintain a cybersecurity incident response plan. Now, this is a carryover from the previous version, but there's a little more impetus on that, and of course, it's directly speaking to what happened with Colonial Pipeline. TSA wants to ensure that utilities can respond to an event when it happens in an effective manner, prevent the spread, and ideally, right, the goal is to prevent an operational impact. So that is out there. Then the final one's very interesting, and I think very impactful, especially given what Leonard had mentioned about the compliance aspects of this. They are requiring entities to develop an internal assessment program to validate the effectiveness of their controls and essentially compliance with the directive. They also rolled in, there was previously a architecture review requirement that is in that internal assessment program as well. They're also looking at penetration testing, red-blue team exercises, things of that nature. So it's putting a very significant requirement on entities to actually self-assess, internally look at what they're doing to assure that they're meeting the objectives. And then, of course, obviously, TSA at some point is going to do rigorous audits and inspections to validate that as well.
That was going to be one of my follow-up questions, was the audit expectations going forward. We know what they have kind of been till today. So you anticipate more rigorous audits than what they did this first round?
I do, and I'll let Leonard weigh in on that, given that he has some federal regulatory experience. I'd be interested to hear his thoughts on what might be coming.
Yeah, I think it's an injustice to the word audit to suggest that what TSA just did in this first year was kind of an audit. I don't know that it even necessarily qualifies as a spot check, but it was basically a couple 4-hour visit at the most by a couple of TSA auditors to have a friendly conversation. We have heard isolated reports of a little bit more rigor in some cases, but for the most part, it definitely was not an audit. Tagging on to something Steve said there on the implementation plan and hearkening back to one of my challenges identified for the industry is the time frame. This implementation plan that's required under version C, the industry gets a whole 90 days to put that together and submit it to TSA for approval. So October 25th is the deadline for that based on the Security directive being released on July 27th. So clock is ticking and a lot of work to do.
What has to be in that implementation plan?
Well, as Steve was saying, I mean, this is less prescriptive, more flexible requirements, measures as they're called in TSA speak, for version C. Essentially, your plan for implementing these measures. A lot of that work will roll over from previous work from version B. We haven't actually talked about that just yet, as far as what happens to all that existing work. Do you still have to keep doing it? As Steve said, these security directives have a 1-year life cycle, and at the end of that 1 year, they expire. In this case, TSA continues to build upon the previous version, and it says, in other words, yes, and yes, continue doing version 1 and continue doing version 2B and now 2C. Interesting how they changed the numbering there. But at any rate, version B is included as an appendix to version C. So very explicit directive in the new version to continue implementing the attachment, essentially version B, up until the implementation plan is approved by TSA. So, what happens at that point? Do you stop doing it? I think it's pretty clear that TSA expects the lion's share of that existing implementation work to roll into your new implementation plan. Certainly there are opportunities to leverage some of the less prescriptive language in the new version, maybe dial back some of your previous implementation, but I guess your mileage may vary depending on how you've implemented it to this point.
Prior to this conversation, we had talked about a new defined term, critical cyber systems. You want to update folks on what critical cyber systems are and what does that mean to their plan?
Sure. So interesting choice of language there. It kind of concatenates some old SIP language, NERC SIP language that we are familiar with on the electrical side. The concepts of critical cyber assets was once a thing. BES cyber systems is now a thing. And so it kind of takes similar wording to come up with this new concept, CCS, critical cyber systems. And it builds upon the IT and OT system concepts that were established in the previous versions of the security directives, and brings in this concept of misuse, something that's been inherent in the SIP standards, which was arguably implied in the previous versions of the security directive, but now is explicit. It's not just the OT systems responsible for control of the pipeline. It's not just the IT systems that are, managing the data that the entity is responsible for maintaining as part of that control, but it's now any system that could be misused to potentially cause an impact on operations. So a much wider net to cast, if you will, as you're scoping your systems that you have to implement these measures for.
Does it leave it to the individual entities to ultimately define what their critical cyber systems are?
Not just define, but also inventory, which was another thing that the previous versions of the security directive did not explicitly require. But now that's pretty much number one, is go identify your critical cyber systems. So a lot of interesting ways to approach that, right? How do you demonstrate to a future auditor that you identified everything? Well, kind of start with the universe of potential in-scope devices and then evaluate them against these new criteria of the IT, the OT, and the CCS aspect of potential misuse.
one of the last questions that I had coming into this conversation today, Steve, you kind of already answered it a little bit, and that is, what do you anticipate will be next from the TSA? You kind of mentioned the auditing being a little more onerous or rigorous, but what do we anticipate next? Security Directive 3, maybe? What does that look like in your mind?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you, I think predicting what a federal agency is going to do tends to be a fool's game. But we can make some educated guesses on what could happen. SD2C is still fairly new, and so obviously there's going to be a focus over the next 90 days or so of people getting their implementation plans submitted to TSA, and they'll be reviewing those. And I think depending on what those look like, TSA will have some reaction to that. They may accept many of them. They may find that many of them are inadequate, and they have to go back and say, no, please try again. But they have indicated that they want to do a rulemaking process to have permanent requirements or standards. So I think that'll be one of the big things we see next. We also know that they're gearing up to do audits, or they refer to them as inspections. So we know that they're hiring or trying to hire at least, and we'll be gearing up for that. So I would expect another round of inspections within the next year or so, and eventually a real audit regime will be developed. But the big one is let's get through SD2C, let's get implementation plans set that are acceptable to TSA, and then let's fasten our seatbelts for the rulemaking process as permanent standards are developed. That'll be, like I say, fasten your seatbelts. That'll be a bit of a ride, I'm sure.
Well, let me maybe wrap stuff up with an open-ended question. And what haven't we talked about that you want to make sure the folks in the industry, are thinking about as they're looking at the security directives, looking at their overall posture? Any last-minute thoughts on what they should be thinking about or should be top of mind?
The thing that comes to mind is the tension between security and compliance. And with this industry being new to the compliance side, they're going to have to learn that. I mean, you can hear from others who've been through it, but until you actually experience that and live through that process, you really don't know and fully understand what it's going to entail. And the reality is we have a new regulator. This is not a case of an agency that's done regulations of this type, expanding them. This is a new regulatory entity. So they're going to be learning and feeling the way through this as well. So an entity may believe they have great security, and they might have great security. That doesn't mean that your compliance is done, right? You have to be able to prove it, demonstrate it, speak to it, document it, and so all that takes effort, and it's a different skill set than simply securing your systems. So there's going to be a bit of a learning curve. It's going to go on for a while. We learned in the electric sector that, they're still learning after a decade and a half. So I would expect there to be a very lengthy learning curve for both the regulator and the industry in this case. For years, I would expect it to take.
Yeah, I concur with that, Steve. I think that's going to be definitely a huge challenge. I mean, independent of navigating version C and these new concepts that we were talking about, certainly it's going to end up being challenging to arguably implement, something that should be easier. It's less prescriptive. We have more flexibility, but that certainly falls under a be careful what you wish for label there. But, from what we're hearing, TSA is very short-staffed. I mean, I have more fingers than they have auditors at the moment. So how long it's going to take for TSA to review the industry's implementation plans and approve them and keep moving this process forward remains to be seen. But whenever that does happen, I concur. I mean, it's going to be challenging to understand, what auditors expect, how to present your evidence, how to respond to questions or not respond, depending on the case. But should be fun.
I think fun is an operative word there, maybe. But, well, Steve and Leonard, I know you both are presenting and having a conversation with the OMG ISAC later this week on this very topic. So members of the industry will be involved in that in great detail here in this week. So I'm sure more will come out of those conversations as well. So maybe we can come back and revisit on our next Direct Connect here with Archer. So Steve, Leonard, thank you for your time. And this has been another Direct Connect with Archer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
If you would like to learn more about the Archer team and how we can protect you, visit our website and reach out with a phone call or an email. If you know of a topic or someone you think we should talk to on Direct Connect, please let us know in the comments below.